Hello Year 5, welcome to your second history lesson. So today we're going to be looking at who the Maya were and where they fit in within our history. So do you remember the story of the Spanish conquistadors who found ruined cities deep in the rainforest of the Mesoamerica? So this is what we looked at last week. Okay, so as a little recap, it was in the 16th century when the Spanish explorers came across these ruins of these abandoned cities when they went on their journey through the rainforest. But it wasn't until 150 years later, in the 19th century, that historians and archaeologists really began to study these remains to try and understand a little bit more about the Maya who had actually left them behind. So we're going to look a little bit more about the history of that in today's lesson. So, the Maya people. So, the ancient Maya people were actually a very sophisticated bunch. So, very smart, very clever, and very intelligent. So, not only had they developed a writing and number system, but obviously they studied and charted the stars and the planets. They invented complex calendars to keep track of time. They also built impressive temples, palaces, monuments, and cities, which we're going to be looking at a little bit more in today's lesson. They are also very skillful in terms of farming the land, and they managed to establish a very complex political system. So really, they were very much the foundation, the basis for a lot of modern day century things that we have today. Now, they were very clever. They were also very deeply religious people, okay? And they were very devout on intelligence and learning. So this actually comes across quite clearly when we're looking at how they've managed to develop such a complex civilization. And obviously it's very complex, but it's very amazing, bearing in mind that this was from over 2,000 years ago that the Maya people and the ancient civilization actually began. So it's amazing to see how much they managed to accomplish in such a small period of time, which has had such a monumental effect on the way our civilization works today. So the Maya civilization came into being around 2000 BC. So BC is before Christ. Okay, and cities such as El Mirador became large and very powerful from 300 BC onwards. Now, around AD 900, this is Anno Domini, so this is after Christ, cities in the rainforest actually became abandoned because people moved up north to highlands such as Guatemala and the Yucatan. Now, this was because there was an extreme drought. So a drought is when there's no water and there's no rain. So obviously this has an effect on farming, it has an effect on land and animal life, and also their ability to be able to have water, to be able to drink and to function in certain cleaning activities. So because there was this drought that lasted for such a long time, people actually needed to move out of the rainforest to somewhere else where they were able to get access to the water. Now, as a result, cities like Chichen Itza, okay, which is one of the great Mayan ancient civilization ruins that's still around today in Mexico, were still thriving at this point in time in AD 1000. And the Maya civilization was then still existing 500 years later. Now, it wasn't actually until the arrival of the Spanish in the 16th century that the ancient cities actually fell to ruin. So obviously they had abandoned their homes, abandoned cities to move in order to protect themselves. So we mentioned at the beginning that we were looking at archaeologists and historians who have found all this amazing information about this civilization. But I wonder if you know what an archaeologist does. Now, you might have looked at this if you've studied ancient Egypt or even ancient Greek in one of your history topics in year 3 and year 4. So let's have a look at what an archaeologist actually does. So their job is to use objects and buildings and to look at the objects and buildings that people in the past have left behind. And they use this to be able to learn from their history. Now, when archaeologists actually started exploring the Mayan ruins, they found a wealth of information about the Mayans. So this could be looking at buildings, it could be artifacts, which are objects that have been left behind that they found. It could be looking at paintings, could be drawings. Anything that they find is a useful tool to be able to explore history and an ancient civilization. So they were actually able to find out a lot about how the society was organised just by looking at their buildings, okay? Now, they knew that the Maya had temples for worship and palaces for kings. So just by looking at the buildings, the way they were built, what might have been found inside them can tell them a lot about what they were used for. So this temple here in this picture is now known as El Castillo, and this is in the Mayan city of Chichen Itza. Now, this was the temple built to worship a god called Kukulkan. Okay, it's a very difficult name to say. So he was one of the ancient gods, and we will actually be looking at the ancient gods in one of our later lessons. So within these buildings, they discovered many objects and artifacts. And obviously these artifacts are all the different materials and things they've found. And it tells us a lot about the society and how the people actually lived. So here, if you look at this picture here of the green mask, this is actually a funeral mask of the King Pakal of Palanque. Okay, so this has been one of the masks that they might have put on them when they have a funeral. So this is one of the fancy dresses that they would have put over them when they were attending a burial. Here on the other side, if I just move my face so you can see, these are actually Mayan flutes. Now you all know what a modern day flute looks like from your flute lessons that you've been having last term. So these were actually the type of flutes that they used to use. Now obviously we can tell these are musical instruments based on the type of instruments we have today, is based on the shape, based potentially on what they're made of. Obviously the holes and the hole at the top of the flute, obviously that they would blow through, and the holes on them that would use to be able to create the different notes. So, I'll just move my beautiful face back over here. So they'd also discovered that the Maya actually had their own writing system. Now we know when we've looked at Egypt, if you studied it before, obviously we had the hieroglyphics, and a lot of the hieroglyphic language was carved into stone. And this used to be something that used to be used on templates, even onto metataphs, which would have been the stone blocks that they would have used, even having them written all over the walls inside temples. So here they had their own writing system. Now this is their hieroglyphs, so pictures that they used to represent words or sounds. So again, very similar to how the ancient Egyptians would use their writing system as well. Now people called epigraphers, okay, so their job was to study the hieroglyphs, use these until they actually understood what they meant. So they actually had to study hundreds and hundreds of pictures of all these different hieroglyphs that the Mayans had written to be able to start to associate between the pictures and what they actually meant. Now, studying Mayan writing on the walls or stone or any of the other artifacts it might have appeared on was very helpful in finding out more information about the Maya. Now, these particular stone slabs were called a stele. So lots of stelae, which is multiple of them, have been found with a lot of these Mayan hieroglyphs on. So these would have been found in various different cities, abandoned cities and ancient ruins across where the Mayan civilization used to exist. Now, over the years of research, historians have actually been able to learn a lot about the Mayan history, and there's lots of different groups of people living within the Mesoamerica. And they actually found that the Maya first settled there around the year 5000 BC. So what we're going to do is we're going to have a quick look at the Mayan timeline. So at the beginning, in 5000 BC to 2000 BC, so you'll notice the timeline of numbers actually goes backwards. So 5000 BC is further away from the starting of the BC. Okay, so as we get closer to the smaller number of BC, we hit AD and then we move up in numbers. So the hunter-gatherers lived in the rainforest and the volcanic mountains. So at that point in time, they were very much a hunting civilization. And as we move on from the year 2000 BC, another 1,000 years later, people actually began to farm and settle into these small villages. So people would copy the crafts of the Olmec people. Now this included making pottery and carving with jade. Now jade is a very rare type of stone, or gemstone rather, but this was something that was used as a basic trade for them to be able to develop. So this is where trading started to begin for the Mayan civilization. Now we hit the year 900 BC, and this is when farmers begin to use irrigation systems. This is where they start to use water and underground systems that they might have built using clay pipes to be able to thrive the land, to grow certain crops and to help their plants grow. So this means they were able to create larger settlements. This is where we start having land of farms where they're able to build and grow different crops. A few 400-500 years later, the first cities began to develop and the Mayan population begins to grow. So we've started off from a small hunting community, we've started within a small farming community, and as they started to learn how to utilise the land and use irrigation systems to grow their materials, we are then looking at starting to build much larger communities. So as a result, the population then starts to grow. And then we hit the year 292 BC, and this is when the first known Mayan writing is produced. So it takes a good few thousand years for them to be able to create this, but obviously this is as population has started to develop. And then in the year 50 BC, we have our very first temple built in Keros. Now, once we've gone beyond this, we're now talking 300 years later, we're now into the year 250 AD. So now we're talking 5,000 years later. So the Maya is now at the beginning of the most powerful era. And obviously we've looked at eras before, so this is a unit of time. where we start something that's very important. So here they've managed to look at astronomy, so they're looking at the stars and mapping planets and the transition of stars. They've also utilised mathematics and architecture, and this is all part of their development. And this is when we start to have time. We have the Mayan calendar. They start to track the time using sundials, which is obviously we've looked at in our space topic this week. And they're looking at mathematics and geometry. But then hit 50 years later, and they adopt the hierarchy of a monarchy. Now, you all know what a monarchy is from our history topic last term when we looked at the Tudors. So a monarchy, okay, which was now ruled by kings, okay, is part of what we have as our royal family. Okay, so we're starting to have this hierarchy of leadership. Now, within 200 to 600 years later, we have major cities that are developing right now. So we've got Tikal, we have Palenque, Uxmal and Copan. So these are some of the big cities, the very first cities within our Mayan civilization where they really started to thrive and develop. At this point in time, we have multiple temples and palaces that are being built. Obviously, when they build their temples, they take into account the art and the culture of the religion as well. So at this point in time, this is also on its rise as well. And then we hit the year 800 to 900 AD, and this is when the major cities actually begin to decline, and obviously cities become abandoned. So if we talk about it going from its most powerful era in 250 AD, we're talking 600 years later, and that Mayan civilization is wiped out from where it originally started from. And this is because we start to have other civilizations that start to become involved, and it eventually becomes abandoned. So this is how these cities have become abandoned, because people began to move on because of the massive drought that had occurred. So I know that's a lot of information, but by all means pause the video and just go through and have a read of that again, just to get a bit more of an understanding to help you. So looking at this timeline, there's a lot to learn from this, especially starting from where it started and where the Mayan civilization ended up before we started to have these cities that got left behind. Because don't forget, we're talking from 800, 900 AD all the way up until the 16th century. We're talking 16,000 years later, 1600 years later. Okay, so we're talking a really long time later before the Spanish conquistadors actually then discovered these ancient ruins. By that point in time, there's nothing to say that civilization hasn't stopped. It's just moved somewhere else. So your task for today is I would like you to complete 2 tasks. The first task is to complete the Mayan civilization timeline. Okay, so we've looked a little bit at the timeline on the slide before, so it might be very useful to go back and pause the video on that timeline to be able to help you with this task. You need to remember that when we are doing the time, it needs to be in chronological order. So we need to have it in date order from when it started to where we ended up on the end of our timeline. Now remember, our dates will go backwards when we're talking about AD. Okay, so the smaller our dates are closer to AD, which means that we're moving up in our timeline. Your second task is to explore some of the artifacts that we've actually looked at in this PowerPoint, and I'd like you to sort the facts relating them to the table that has been sent home to you. Now you will need to use the PowerPoint to help you with each of the slides to know whether those artifacts are true or false. Any artifacts you're not sure about that haven't been mentioned in here, and we don't have any clear indication to say that they are true or false, you need to put into the I don't know column. Okay? So you will need to use this PowerPoint on this video to go back and to pause it at various points in time to help you locate some of these artifacts. Okay? Please make sure at some point this week you send in some pictures of your work that you have done so that I can send you back some feedback, but more importantly, so that I can also post some of your fantastic work on Twitter. Okay, I really hope you're enjoying this. There is a lot more work for us to be looking at for this topic, but have a go at those 2 tasks and make sure you send me any of your work. Okay, good luck.